Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. This week we take a look at the intriguing story of the first person to ever take off in a hot air balloon and then return it to the same spot where it took off. What's the big deal, you say? Well, until then, hot air balloons took off without any trouble, but then they went wherever the wind took them, and they didn't really have any choice, but they never landed back where they had departed from. Well, our guest today is Eric Offgang, a freelance journalist who's no stranger to Amazing Tales listeners. He's been published in the New York Times, Connecticut Magazine, the Smithsonian, just to name a few. Well, he has the story of Charles Ritchel. Ritchel is the first man to create a hot air balloon that could land from where it had taken off. It was an incredible feat in the 1870s, and Eric will be along in just a moment with that story. This week's trivia question: this plane hit a skyscraper in New York City, but it wasn't the Twin Towers. What building was it? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you'll have the topic for next week's show. Connecticut's been the leader on many aeronautic fronts. For example, the first helicopter was by Igor Sikorsky, and it was test flown in Stratford in 1939. Arguably, the first airplane flight occurred in Fairfield back in 1901 near Jennings Beach, flown by Gustav Whitehead, 2 years before the Wright brothers. We featured that story just a few weeks ago here on Amazing Tales About History. And one of the first commercial hot air balloonists to perform across the country was Silas Brooks of Plymouth. He worked for P.T. Barnum, among others. Also, many of the engines that power today's commercial and military jets were created and built at Pratt & Whitney in East Hartford. And if you want to throw in outer space, the Hubble Space Telescope was built in Danbury. Now, those are just the headlines when it comes to firsts in aeronautics in Connecticut. Many other inventions that make flying possible have their roots here, too. Well, today we take a look at an achievement that doesn't get a lot of attention these days, but was considered a very big deal when it occurred in Hartford back in 1878. We're talking about Charles Ritchel and the hot air balloon contraption that he developed, which took off from Hartford and then landed in the very same spot after flying around in the air. It was the first time a hot air balloon had been able to be steered in flights. Now, Charles Ritchel is not exactly a household name, yet he was a prolific inventor who has patents in his name from a wide variety of creations, some of which are more practical, frankly, than others. In all, though, about 150 patents are credited to Ritchel. Yet few of those activities that he engaged in rose to the level of importance as what happened on a Wednesday in Hartford, June 12, 1878. It was a sunny and relatively calm day in the skies, a perfect day for Ritchel and his assistant pilot Mark Quinlan to demonstrate Ritchel's latest contraption, a steerable, lighter-than-air craft. And here to tell us that story is freelance journalist and writer Eric Offgang. Well, Eric, it's good to have you back. And again, for our regular listeners, we spoke a few weeks ago about Gustav Whitehead, a Bridgeport guy who may have been the first to fly and have beaten the Wright brothers by 2 years in terms of actually achieving what we call heavier-than-air flight. And I want to start off talking about that, heavier-than-air, lighter-than-air, because at that time, about 1900, this was very confusing to people. What do you mean flying lighter than air or flying heavier than air? Can you just take a second to explain and define what are we talking about with those two different terms?
Yeah, so lighter than air aircraft are things like balloons, dirigibles, blimps, craft that fly thanks to a lighter than air gas, whether it's helium or hydrogen. They're more or less floating through the air. Whereas a heavier than aircraft, a powered aircraft, is not relying on that. It's relying on its engine, its lift. If the engine goes down, if a wing comes off, it'll sink. Modern airplanes are examples of this, helicopters as well.
Now, let's talk about Charles Ritchel, because he was involved in the lighter-than-air technology at a very early stage in the 1870s. He was a Bridgeport guy, and I guess he was quite an inventor from what I've read.
He was a toy maker, an inventor, just this wonderful character. He had these ideas that were so outlandish, so fascinating. Different types of toys and figures to some type of assassination tool and things like that. And just had his hand in a bunch of different areas. To one of the world's fairs, he had a proposal of a periscoping building that would rise from like 500 feet to 1,000 feet over a period of hours. And he also was an aviation enthusiast. And what he was trying to do was develop a craft that could take off and land at the same point. By this point, in 1878, balloons had long been around, lighter than air balloons. They could go up in the air, and then they were kind of at the mercy of the wind. The only way to steer them was to reduce weight and try to get into different altitudes and find kind of a different air current, a different path of wind to be carried on. He wanted to create a device that could go against the wind. At the time, Ritchel and others had started to develop an ability to steer a little bit. And these were kind of the first dirigibles. And that's what the term even means, the ability to steer. They were pretty imperfect and weren't capable of taking off and landing at the same spot.
And this is very interesting. I've been in a hot air balloon, and I'll just do a quick rabbit hole story. When we went up, the guy brought a roll of toilet paper, and I said, well, what was that for? And he said, well, that's so we can steer. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And we were up, a couple thousand feet, and he pulled off a little tiny piece of paper, toilet paper, and dropped it down, and we watched it fall down. And suddenly, I don't know, a couple hundred feet down, it started going a different direction. And he said, now, if we were to lower the balloon to that altitude, we would go in that direction. And that's how you steer a hot air balloon. I was fascinated by how that worked. So your point is well taken. These balloons were absolutely at the whim of the wind. And if you could fight back against the wind, you really had something in your hands. And we didn't have airplanes at that point. We only had these hot air balloons or lighter than air structures. So he had this little device, 25 feet long. It had a hydrogen cylinder wrapped in canvas and I guess a skeletal structure underneath it with a seat. And I guess he used pedals how did he do that?
It's just this wild looking contraption. He's got, it kind of looks like a bicycle. It's a steel skeletal structure. It's got a hand crank and pedals for steering. The pilot would be hanging from the cylinder. And it just looks like something that if you saw it, you'd just be like, that never flew.
One of the things I loved in your article is you pointed out that this guy said at some point, he said, people used to laugh at me, but they laughed at Noah too. And I just had to throw that in. So tell us now about Hartford, Connecticut. He goes to a baseball field with thousands of spectators, and what happens there?
Yeah, so he holds this event to try out this new craft. He's funding this through these public expositions. People pay a nominal fee to watch him. You watch him, and if it's a success, it's great. And in a very morbid way, if it doesn't go well, people would probably want to see that too. He holds this expo, has an assistant who's a lightweight. He's very small, under 100 pounds. And that's because the contraption is pretty delicate. A full-sized person might throw things off. So this pilot gets in, he raises up into the air. There's tons of witnesses. He goes out over the Connecticut River. The winds give him a little trouble here and there, but it's a relatively calm day. And he is able to make his way back to the field and land the craft exactly where he took off, which is a pretty big milestone because up until that point, that was something that no one had been able to do with a dirigible. As far as we know, there's no records of anyone doing it earlier.
So this was something that actually drew attention nationwide, didn't it?
Yes, a number of publications, both locally and nationally, including a large feature in Harper's Weekly that included a artist recreation of the craft.
One of the things that's always important with an invention is repeating it. And so he was having some success and some failures in terms of trying to repeat this. Tell us what happened on the 4th of July in Boston. I guess there was just an incredible fiasco with that launch.
Yeah, so, he tried it again the next day in Hartford. He got blown way towards New Haven, ended up quite a bit outside of Hartford, but he was able to land it. He just wasn't able to get back to where he started. And he kept going around sort of touring with it. And so in Boston, a little bit afterwards, something went wrong with the device so that Quinlan, the pilot, wasn't able to lower it. And it kept rising upwards and upwards. And he couldn't bring it down. The wind had carried him away. And so he just kind of disappears to the onlookers and going up and up and up. Mark Quinlan realizes that he has to make kind of an in-flight repair. So he leaves his seat, carries a knife or a tool, leans over and is able to make an adjustment. And as he's soaring up, I think, the estimate was that he got as high as 3,000 feet. And he's able to, hanging over the edge, make this, aerial repair and then land the craft, which is just kind of amazing. I couldn't find anything out about him, but he's this amazing character who was either crazy or very brave because he kept going up in this craft even after that.
And it's interesting, as you point out, he finances this by going and showing off and charging people, a certain amount to get in and take a look at this. And as a result, some people said, well, is he really an aeronaut, a very serious, guy who wants to fly, or is he a showman? And you kind of had to be a little bit of each, didn't you?
Yeah, and he comes from this period in time where there was a real blurred line between the two. There was sort of these aerial showmen who would fund what they did, who would do these early aviation experiments and would fund it through that. Part of it was they were showmen and show people, and they just wanted to, make a living. But they also were trying to perfect these craft and come up with new ways. So, I think Ritchel, had a flair for the dramatic. He's a self-proclaimed professor. He obviously is a character, but he also, really wants to bring aviation into this field. So he's a true inventor and also a true showman.
Now, when he ends up passing away, he does not have the glory of having mastered the rigid dirigible. That goes to a guy named Zeppelin. And from what I understand, I think it was in your article, he just flat out refused to put an engine on his device, didn't he?
I'm extrapolating that he thought it was going to be too much weight. So he thought that a person-controlled device would be better. And he had plans for designing a bigger version of it with, multiple people working the crank and generating more power that way. And it just kind of, aviation historians who look at him today know that he was kind of doomed from the start. There was no way he was going to ever be able to overcome significant winds. It could work on a calm day, but there was no way he was going to ever be able to develop, a real practical aircraft. It wasn't a fantastic idea in a lot of ways, though it also was kind of ingenious in other ways. But it's interesting because when I started doing this story, I originally wrote a short story about it for Kinetic Magazine many years ago. And my editor at the time, when he was reading the article, saw that he actually predated the date listed for the first dirigible flight. And so I reached out to some different historians both then and then again, and they kind of all agreed that, this flight, unlike Gustav Whitehead, who we talked about previously, where his most impressive flight didn't have a whole lot of witnesses, it had a couple witnesses. This had thousands of witnesses, many reporters. It did happen this way. There's no dispute about that. It's just, it then got forgotten by history, even though it was well known at the time. And one of the reasons, I think, is that impracticality of it. The success couldn't really be built on.
It's true. Ritchel's design, although it worked and was shown to be credible on several occasions, was not the answer to lighter-than-air flights. That solution came from Germany with an invention by Ferdinand von Zeppelin and his lighter-than-air dirigible. Well, in 1913, Zeppelin's creation was flying over German cities with paying customers for sightseeing tours. Many people thought that the Hindenburg disaster in 1937 was the beginning of the end of hot air flights. That's when 36 people were killed when the gas-filled blimp blew up after an electrostatic charge set it off. Well, actually, aeronautic historians point to a different cause for the demise of hot air balloon flying. The first flight by Pan American Airways from San Francisco across the Pacific Ocean to Manila was actually faster and cheaper. And the plane, well, it could ride above storm clouds. A blimp often had to land when bad weather moved in. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. Like many intrepid inventors of his day, Charles Ritchel had more creativity than business sense. He died penniless in 1911, just 2 years before the Zeppelin flights started over German cities. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Eric Aufgang, freelance reporter whose work has appeared many places, including Connecticut Magazine, the New York Times, and Smithsonian Magazine. The answer to this week's trivia question: this plane hit a skyscraper in New York City, but we're not talking about the Twin Towers. What building was it? The answer: the Empire State Building. And next week on Amazing Tales, we look back at the unbelievable story of when a plane crashed into the Empire State Building, but remarkably did not knock it over. And we'll have a look at a mid-air collision of two planes over New York City and a separate incident that many have forgotten about from 60 years ago that killed more than 125 people. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.